In the 110 years tanks have been on the battlefield, many of them have earned a reputation as effective war machines.
Take the Sherman, for example. Well liked by its crews, and despite being inferior in some ways to their German counterparts, they made up for it in other ways. Despite this, though, you could make an argument that the Sherman is overrated, since little from the design survived past the end of World War II. In the years since World War II, the M4 Sherman has also come around from being considered a tank grossly inferior to its opponents, and as a result, some do exaggerate how good it really was. However, when I think of the term overrated, the Sherman isn't really what comes to mind. For instance, take the German Maus super heavy tank. Hundreds of videos talk about the story of this tank, and many have traveled thousands of miles to see the surviving example. Being both one of the largest and still to this day the heaviest tank ever built, it certainly deserves to be remembered. That being said, however, at the end of the day, it never saw significant combat use, likely never seeing combat at all, with the only complete example being blown up to prevent capture. Yet despite this, the Maus still gets more attention than many far more successful tanks. Don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of the Maus and it's one of my favorite tanks, but there's no way to deny it gets way more praise than it should. This is what comes to mind when the term overrated is thrown around. Not a tank which has genuinely earned a good reputation, but rather one which has done nothing to deserve the immense fan base it has acquired. Similarly, a vehicle like the FV4005 may have something unique to it, like carrying the largest anti-tank gun ever fitted to a tank chassis. There's certainly no denying that the ability to effectively knock out any enemy tank in a single shot is impressive. Once again though, unlike other tanks such as the Centurion it was based on, this never saw service or even production, and was only ever intended as a stopgap for a purpose-built tank to carry the gun. Sure, it certainly could have been effective as a tank killer, but the only tank killing reputation it has, which isn't purely theoretical, comes from video games. There's really no beating one-shotting a tank with it in World of Tanks or War Thunder, but we'd be kidding ourselves if it isn't overrated when compared to other tanks which saw both production and a successful service with one or more militaries. That isn't to say that a successful tank can't also be overrated, and once again, we can look to Germany for an example. Now, compared to the last couple, my next pick is quite a bit more of a hot take, but I would consider the Panzer IV to be overrated. I can already sense the disturbance of dozens of comments crying out, but let me at least make my case first before you bite my head off. There's no denying that the Panzer IV was a good tank, at least for the 1930s and early 1940s. These earlier variants aren't the reason why I consider it overrated, however, with that being largely due to the extremely common thing many fans of the tank like to say that, if they had only built more Panzer IVs. Aside from this ignoring the many bigger problems Germany was dealing with by the middle of the war, the tank was simply outdated and overweight. This was a tank designed all the way back in the mid-30s, and with that came all of the limitations of an older platform. We see these especially for some of the heavier variants such as the Sturmpanzer IV, overworking the suspension and drivetrain, leading to increased breakdowns. The protection as well could only be improved so much before the weight grew too much for the chassis and the flat plates were considerably less effective than those of its replacement, the Panther. For as many problems as the Panther had during production, it was in every way an improvement over the Panzer IV. A better suspension meant it could carry more weight, allowing for larger guns, and the less complicated armor layout made for easier production. So while I would never say that the Panzer IV was a bad tank, I would certainly say it is overrated by modern fans, especially when compared to the next generation. All of these examples we've looked at so far are largely thanks to tank fans, but what about when a vehicle is overrated by its enemies? This happens quite often, but probably the best example of this is the Soviet IS-3 heavy tank. When these things were unveiled to the Allies in 1945 during the victory parades, it certainly sent a shock through those who saw it. With armor capable of shrugging off basically anything it could face from the Germans or Allies, and them already seemingly available in large numbers, you can understand why. Between these and the large hordes of T-54s and T-55s which began to be churned out in the coming years, you can understand why there was a bit of a panic among Western militaries regarding this red menace. Fortunately for us, these fears were largely unfounded, at least in the case of the IS-3. In reality, the tank was plagued by problems both in reliability and even its construction, with some of the welds being prone to cracking. The widespread adoption of fin-stabilized heat rounds during the Cold War also quickly made the pike nose armor, which was resistant to most traditional armor-piercing rounds, much easier to punch through. No matter how you slice it, the IS-3 was vastly overrated by many for a tank which saw only minimal service, with the most significant uses being in Hungary during the 1956 revolution, and later by Egypt against Israel in the 1960s. I don't think I've primed my comment section for enough hate and profanity yet though, so my last pick should hopefully have that covered. This family of tanks is still in service today in ever-decreasing numbers. Some of you might be thinking I'd pick the T-72 or maybe even the T-14 Armada, and I could certainly agree they fall into this category somewhat. However, neither of these has a fan base quite as rabid as the British Challenger tanks. Now, as much as I like making fun of the British, I'm not going to say these tanks are bad. They've certainly proven they are capable in combat. As we have established throughout the video though, this isn't the only thing that can make a tank overrated, and when compared to the tanks their allies have in service, the Challenger platform definitely gets more credit than it deserves. This can be seen more recently with the number of people touting the Challenger 3 as the first next-gen MBT, or bringing up the story of the Challenger which survived a seemingly ever-increasing number of RPG shots. Better yet, how many times have you heard someone bring up the fact it has a rifled barrel, implying that makes it more accurate compared to other MBTs which use smoothbores? The biggest fault of the Challenger isn't the tank itself though, but rather the British military itself. According to many sources, the entire fleet of Challenger 2s is under 300, with only around half of those actually ready for combat. Even if the Challenger 3 was the best tank on the planet, that doesn't help much if you can't replace them. If you're a fan of these tanks, you may still disagree, but I hope you can at least see why I would consider it overrated.
I could probably keep going on these all day, and if you all enjoyed this video enough, maybe I will turn this into a bit of a series in the future, but I think that's enough for today. I'd love to hear what you think down in the comments though. What tanks do you think are overrated, and do you agree with all of my picks, or do you strongly disagree? If you did enjoy this video, you can show your support for the content by checking out the links down in the description to check out my store where you can buy Kobe sets like the ones you see behind me, as well as model kits. And you can also subscribe to my new newsletter, which will provide you a curated list of tank content both from myself, notifying you of new uploads, and from other creators in this space. So if you're sick of relying on algorithms for all of your content, check that out because it might help you. If you do want to rely on the algorithm though, it thinks you'll enjoy one of these videos popping up on your screen now. And you know, the algorithm never lies. A lot of you asked on the last video, so here you go. Here are the chickens. They are not cute anymore. They have passed that and gotten to the very ugly stage, but they're almost ready to go outside to join the big chickens. For now, though, they get to keep stinking it up in here.